It's 1979. James Dyson is 32. The young engineer is just getting his career started. He's had one project already up and running called the Sea Tank. It was a fiberglass flat bottom boat that he was working on with a well-established designer called Jeremy Fry. And Jeremy Fry will be an important part of this story as we go along. But the first invention that he had was something called the ball barrow, and the ball barrow was essentially a wheelbarrow, but instead of the wheel in the front, he replaced it with a rubber inflatable ball, and it just enabled maneuverability and turning around your wheelbarrow when when it had a heavy load on there. And during that period of time, one of the things he had to do as he was manufacturing his ball barrows was he had to get the front forks, imagine a bicycle, the forks of the ball barrow painted. And to do that, of course, a lot of the spray paint would miss the forks and just waft around in the air. And he was wondering, gee, is this very safe and is this a good thing for the people, himself and others working on it? He discovered that, the big guns, if you like, what they do is use a system called a cyclone extractor that would pull the air out using a centrifugal force, and it would separate the particles from the air and cleaning the air at the same time. And he thought, okay, that's what he needs to do. Now, he actually had seen one of these extractors. Just down the street from him, there was a timber mill, and the timber mill had an extractor, a cyclone extractor, to suck the sawdust away from the timber mill. So one night he decides to jump over the fence, he takes a whole bunch of measurements, and he goes and creates his own cyclone extractor. Just as this was all happening, he, as coincidence would have it, he actually bought himself a vacuum cleaner. And it was a big Hoover, it was, top of the line, and as he was using it, eventually the suction stopped working. He thought, oh, gee, what's going on here? He pulls out the bag, he empties it, because he doesn't have any replacements. He empties the bag, and then he puts it back in, and there's still no suction. And he's going, oh, gee, what's going on? And when he looks at the bag, he realizes that the dust and grime is actually embedded in the pores of the bag. There was no flow through air, and he was thinking to himself, wouldn't it be much better if it just didn't have a bag? And that's when the penny dropped. Of course, he'd been working with these cyclone extractors. He wondered whether he could create a cyclone extractor that would fit into a vacuum cleaner. So that night, he gets out his cardboard, his scotch tape, and he creates a prototype, his very first prototype. And in that, he shows himself and proves to himself that it could actually work, right? That was prototype number one. So with this exciting idea, he races back to his work to sort of pitch it to his colleagues. And of course, his colleagues just didn't have any interest in this. They thought, well, if the big guys hadn't already decided to do it, surely it's something that they, have considered and crossed off their list. So he decides to resign from the company. He goes to his friend Jeremy Fry and he says, I need some investment for this new business, Dyson Incorporated. £50,000, I'll give you 49%. Jeremy Fry totally agrees. He's really into the idea, and they get going. Well, 4 years later, as Dyson is creating prototype after prototype, he finally gets one that he's totally happy with. He's built 1,127 prototypes. Right? It's just massive. And in each one, he's just changing one small characteristic so he can see exactly how that's going to impact the whole system. So anyway, now that he's got it, all his prototypes, he's got one that works, he patents the idea, and he goes back out to the big guys to sort of see whether they'd be interested in licensing his idea. And of course, they have no interest whatsoever, because they have a bag industry, which, the sort of vacuum bag industry, which was worth around £100 million a year, that would be decimated if you had something that didn't require bags. They didn't want to do that. They didn't want to disrupt that revenue flow. So again, Dyson was just out on the streets looking around for someone to invest in his idea. Well, he happened to eventually go to a bank, and the bank manager was asking for a lot of money to do this. He wanted £600,000 to sort of manufacture his vacuum cleaners, and The bank manager was hesitant, but went home one night, sort of pitched the idea to his wife, and his wife was just thrilled with the idea. The idea of not having bags just delighted her. So the next day, with that and of course all the other things that he collected, he decided to give Dyson £600,000, and they started building these machines. They first of all sold them in catalogues. They went to all the different markets that they could. They were having trouble getting them into retail stores, but the big breakthrough is when they got to John Lewis, the big department store in the UK, who took them on as something novel and different. And within a year of that happening, his company was making £100 million a year. It became the biggest selling vacuum cleaner in the history of the world. It is now the top of the market for the UK, the top of the market for the US, and he's just totally upended an industry in the process.